Good morning, everybody. Let me try that again. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Thursday. How are we all doing? 2 more days. For those of you who weren't here on Monday, my name is Paul Kautz. I'm the Director of Education for TDWI. I'm the guy that's responsible for all the classes that you're in and the instructors that are there. So I hope you had a very productive week of education, and you got 2 more days of it, so keep powering through. But just as importantly, I hope you used the time wisely and got your networking in and made some relationships and some ongoing things that you can use after you go back to your corporation. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Tomorrow morning, classes start sharply at 8 a.m. The breakfast will be right outside of registration, so where the breaks have been the last couple days. Lunch will be shorter tomorrow. They'll shorten the lunch area so we can get you out of here about 3:30 in the afternoon to catch your flights and everything. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll be around the next couple days. So hope you enjoy the last 2 days. And with that, introducing this morning's keynoters. We have 1 in-house and 1 remote. Dr. Fern Halper is in Boston. She could not make it down. She's got a back problem and couldn't fly, so she'll be with us via the phone line and doing it. So Dr. Fern Halper is TDWI's Research Director for Advanced Analytics. She has over 20 years of experience in data analysis, business analysis, and strategy development. She is a recognized expert in the field of analytics and has authored hundreds of reports and articles on data mining and information technology. Prior to joining TDWI, Fern was a partner at Hurwitz & Associates, an industry analyst firm where she focused her research primarily on analytics and cloud computing. She also spent 8 years at Bell Laboratories, leading the development of innovations and innovative approaches and systems to analyze marketing and operational data at AT&T's marketing and business teams. She may have been one of the first data scientists. Fern has taught at Bentley College and Colgate University. She has co-authored numerous dummies publications, including Cloud Computing for Dummies, Hybrid Cloud for Dummies, and Big Data for Dummies. She received her BA from Colgate University and her PhD from Texas A&M University. Our second keynoter is Krish Krishnan. He is the founder and president of Sixth Sense Advisors, a management consulting and independent technology analyst firm based in Chicago. He is a recognized expert worldwide in strategy, architecture, and implementation of big data, text analytics, and high-performance data warehousing. He has written 2 books, Building the Unstructured Data Warehouse with Bill Inman, and Data Warehousing in the Age of Big Data, and is working on a 3rd book on social analytics. A sought-after strategy consultant, Krish has implemented many large-scale and complex data warehouse and big data projects. Krish teaches at TDWI and other conferences worldwide on subjects related to data, including governance, management, architecture and design, and deployment and implementation. He publishes with the BI Network and many other trade publications, and his Twitter handle is @DataGenius. So with that, I give you Krish live and Fern on the phone.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Why are we here this morning? 2 reasons. Big data. One is big, the other is data. Why do we need to talk about big data for 45 minutes on Thursday morning? This was a question that Paul asked Fern and I when he asked us to prepare for the keynote. And at that time, TDWI was bringing together the world's first big data maturity model, something that each one of you in this room can log in, take as an assessment, get feedback from the model, and help your organization move across layers of maturity. Our goal here in the next 45 minutes is to share with you what we have done in the model, how does it work, what do you get as feedback, and how do you use this model to progress on your journey into integrating big data Next year or the year after that, I'm sure we're going to call big data something else. We're going to get a technology better than Hadoop maybe, something called Timbuktu, who knows? And we'll be talking about that. But at this point in time, the biggest pain point that captures your CIO, your CTO, your CMO, your CRO, and your CSO's attention is this word big data. What is big data? As we looked for definitions, we didn't want to go back and talk about volume, velocity, and variety. So we said it's Thursday morning, let's start with Dilbert. If you've seen this before, look at what happens in this cartoon. At the end of the cartoon strip, Dilbert says, shh, it can hear us. Big data means you have entered into a world beyond just static data that you collect. We are talking about a universe where you are generating data 24/7 by 365 every second, literally. There is data extraneous to the organizations that we work in, creating behaviors. When I say behaviors, we're talking about behaviors of us, human beings, in a social / personal / community lifestyle. Those behaviors are what create an inflection point that makes a Facebook or a Procter & Gamble, or can wipe out a Circuit City and Blockbuster. So these behaviors are what we want to understand how to bring into the enterprise. That is what big data is all about. In reality, what strikes us is that this volume of data, look at that volume that is coming at us, comes across in multiple spreads. You have documents inside your organization of different kinds, the social networks, and then the devices. BYOD, BYOA. Oh yeah, the biggest things to happen for an industry, the greatest things that will change lifestyle, will also be a big pain point for organizations. Because you are generating data constantly, somebody is monitoring it, there is a chance of security leaks, there is a chance of intrusion into those networks. So how do you take care of all these situations? Who manages them? When you and I talk of big data in a classroom setting, we talk about data and all the issues in the infrastructure layer. But you have to go beyond that, and that is what big data maturity is all about. Understanding big data is one thing. Maturing in it is a whole different subject area. Big data is not Hadoop. How many of you, by show of hands in this room, believe that if you do a Hadoop project, you are doing big data work? Well, I have a couple of hands coming up. That's good. Let me tell you this. By just putting a technology in place, you are not doing big data. By just getting Hadoop POC, you are not doing big data. Big data is a combination of technologies and techniques. What techniques are these techniques? We have a number of courses in TDWI. There are about 14 courses exclusively focusing on big data and analytics that we teach at every conference. These techniques are the techniques that you need to think about. These are the techniques you need to learn. Having said that, take a step back and think. I'm here on the stage talking about big data, putting forth the perspective that it's beyond Hadoop, it's not equal to Hadoop, and I'm talking about an evolution. Big data is not revolution. Big data is not somebody getting on a racehorse in Kentucky Derby and winning the race. That's not big data. You have to go through stages of pain before you come into this evolutionary world. And as you go through each stage of pain and growth, you will realize that you are arming yourself as a company, people, process, technology, all inclusive, with better insights. How do you justify a business case? How do you justify the ROI? How do you justify every dollar that you spend? Yes, as you go from being a chimp to being that human being. There are a lot of forces at play that will influence this growth. As Fern and I went through this exercise for the last year, we went back a number of times to the TDWI executives, Paul Kautza and Dr. Richard Zipfit, Dave Wells. We also spoke to Philip Russum and David Starder, and we kept asking questions. We said, we are talking about data that's going to come across from different realms in this world. The Internet of Things will change and accelerate what big data means to a company. And who is the Internet of Things? Anybody? Who is the Internet of Things? Or what is the Internet of Things? How many of you have been following this discussion? The Internet of Things. If you have not, I advise that you should start, because that will determine our life in the future, personally and professionally. When these forces are at play and generate different kinds of data in different formats, there is a third dimension called time. We need to look at what is happening with respect to time. And time here is not the human minute, it is the internet minute. That brings us to this next slide. We're seeing this technology conundrum that is at play in all our minds. On the upper half of this deck, you are seeing that we have our traditional data warehouse business intelligence technologies that we've all used. The lower half is all data processing, acquisition, and management technologies related to big data. Do we throw Cognos out and bring Tableau in? Do we throw Talent out and bring in a Density? Do we throw Oracle out and bring in Hortonworks? There is no throwing of anything at this point. We are talking about extending the data warehouse. We're talking about a maturity journey that's going to teach you how to integrate these two worlds very effectively from a 5-dimension perspective. What does this do to you? In the year 2001, Gary Hamel wrote a book called Leading the Revolution. If you guys haven't read this book, pick up a PDF. It's available still on the internet. It was published by Harvard Business Review. It's called Leading the Revolution. And Gary said, in the new way of life, which is called the new brick, innovation becomes a standard feature. When innovation becomes a standard feature, what do we expect to happen in society? If innovation is a way of life for you every single day, what do you expect life to be? More complex or more simple? I know a lot of you are having mouthfuls of food. I just want an answer. If you have innovation as a way of life, does life become simple or does it get more complex? More complex or more simple? Okay, by show of hands, simple. All right, I have a few guys saying simple, so I think we're doing the good stuff. Complex. Wow, that's interesting. There is a lot more hands that went up when I said complex. I think if we go through this book and realize how innovation should be done and how it comes into our lives, as an everyday journey to success, life becomes a lot more simple. Innovation as a way of life changes the way an organization works. Why do you think Procter & Gamble and Unilever are still thriving in spite of a lot more companies doing the products that they're doing? Why do you think Sam's Club and Costco still have a presence in spite of an Amazon.com? Because innovation is a way of life in these companies. But that brings a paradigm shift. And this is the shift that we want you guys to talk about and think about. In the data warehouse, IT does everything and business consumes the data. In the big data world, IT is a facilitator. Business owns, manages, and drives the program. Until you understand this shift and get the controls to the business teams and the business owners and make them become a part of your data scientist teams, your success in big data from a people perspective will still be questionable. Have companies done this model? Yes, they have. Who are these companies? Well, there are quite a few, but some of them don't want their names to be mentioned. So in due respect, we are going to just tell you that this is something that is working fine. So with that, at this point, I would like to invite Fern to take this presentation through the next few slides. Fern, over to you.
Thanks, Krish. Hi, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm going to pick it up on why a maturity model. And what's happening is that many organizations, as Krish mentioned, are collecting increasing amounts of disparate data, and it's sometimes more than they feel that they can deal with. But they realize that analyzing the data can actually provide a competitive advantage. So as big data rolls out, we've been getting questions from our members about what they should be doing, if anything, in terms of big data. They want to know where to start. They want to understand what other companies are doing with big data. And they want to understand best practices for big data. And frankly, they want to know if they're missing anything. So Krish and I created this big data maturity model to help companies address some of these questions. The model is really about providing guidance to companies and helping them understand where they've been, where they are, and where they still need to go. So it really provides a structure and a methodology to monitor and measure progress. And what we ended up with at the end of our own big data journey was both a guide and an interactive model that I'm going to describe in a minute. And what these two pieces do is actually to help organizations understand where they stand relative to their peers in terms of their big data efforts. And additionally, in each stage of maturity, what it takes to get to the next level of maturity and what the expectations are of that level of maturity. So in order to develop the model, we interviewed many end users as well as vendors, and we also used existing TDWI research. And we worked with our sponsors, whom we want to thank. Krish, could you move to the next slide? And our sponsors are Cloudera, IBM, MarkLogic, and Pentaho. So these were the sponsors that also helped us develop the model, and we're very grateful and appreciative to them. So if we can move to the next slide about the big data maturity model. You can see that the big data maturity model consists of 5 stages and a chasm. And the stages start at the nascent stage, moving to pre-adoption, early adoption, corporate adoption, and mature and visionary. And you can see that the early adoption stage, which is the one in the mustard color, is the longest. It takes companies sometimes the longest to get out of that stage. And there's also a chasm between early adoption and corporate adoption. So Krish is going to talk about the characteristics of each stage in a few minutes. What I wanted to talk about was what it takes to actually achieve maturity and the factors involved, and then how to take the assessment. Now you'll see here that there's something in red, a big URL. which is the URL for the assessment, which is www.tdwi.org/BDMM. So BDMM, Big Data Maturity Model. So I'm hoping that you're all writing this down because it would really be great if everyone in the room could take the assessment. So if we move to the next slide, talking about the factors to achieve maturity. So I wanted to talk about the factors that form the core of the model, which are the factors that we think are needed to achieve big data maturity in order to be successful in big data. So we've listed the 5 here, and in the model we refer to them as dimensions. And there's 5: organization, infrastructure, data management, analytics, and governance. So why did we pick these? Well, big data maturity is an evolution of an organization to integrate, manage, and leverage relevant data sources. It's really a journey that involves building an ecosystem of technologies and techniques that require people and processes to make it successful. So it's ecosystem of technologies and techniques that require people and processes. So hence you can see that these 5 dimensions are all around technology, techniques, people, and processes. So for example, the organization dimension looks at the strategy, culture, leadership, and funding to support a successful big data initiative. So you'd be asked questions about what's going on organizationally in your company in terms of big data. So for instance, if the funding is only occurring in IT and it hasn't moved to the business, then you're not as mature as a company that might have both business and IT funding, or business support and funding in the business. Infrastructure. So this dimension examines how coherent the architecture is for big data and what technologies are in place to support the initiative. So the sign of a company that's mature versus one that's not as mature would be that their infrastructure is not siloed. Data management looks at how extensive the data sources are and how the company manages them to support big data and big data analytics. So we'll ask questions about collecting data, what type of data you're collecting. And you may be collecting a lot of data, but you're not managing it. So managing that data that you're collecting is a sign of maturity, but more so, doing something with that data, actually analyzing it, is another sign of maturity, which gets us into analytics. And that looks at how advanced the company is in its use of analytics, and also includes the skills to make it happen. And then the final one is governance. And that looks at how coherent is the governance strategy. Now I want to say that some companies think that they don't need governance. And Krish and I talked to a number of companies when we developed this model. It wasn't just about traditional companies. We talked to a lot of small e-businesses that were using big data. And maybe they didn't even have a data warehouse. Maybe they were just going straight to Hadoop. But at the end of the day, and some of them even agreed with this, some of them said, well, we don't have time for governance right now. And others said, we know that if we don't govern our data, that if we grow too fast, the fact that we don't have a governance structure in place is going to come back to haunt them. Because governance isn't just about a big company, setting policies in place. It's about asking questions such as, what does an item actually mean, in big data? What's the provenance of the data? Those sorts of things. And so the smart, smaller companies and e-businesses realized that they were going to have to deal with that as well. So those are the 5 dimensions of the model. We can go to the next slide, Krish. Now, I said that we spoke to a lot of end users, vendors, as well as looked at research to develop the questions that went into the assessment. So this next set of slides actually comes from one of the best practices reports on big data management that Philip Brussum wrote last year, or this past year, I should say. It was published in 2013. And in that, he looked at some of the challenges that companies faced when embarking on big data, because in our mind, overcoming those challenges is key in gaining maturity. So I said we used different types of research. This was one example of the kind of research that we were looking at. And Philip asked, what problems hinder the successful management of big data in your organization? Select 7 or fewer. And there were 461 respondents, over 2,000 responses, across all of the factors that he was asking about. And here we broke this out into the organizational factors. The list is much longer, and we'll go through a few of these. But the number one challenge was staffing or skills, followed by a lack of business sponsorship and a business case. You can see that the inadequate staffing or skills was up at over 35%, followed by these other factors. Why am I showing this? Is because these are the kinds of issues that are reflected in the questions that we ask in the organization and other dimensions. So we find that many organizations just getting started with big data do lack business sponsorship. A lot of times it's happening in IT, at least for these larger organizations. And they also lack a business case, which means that it's hard to get funding. So since they're not working with the business, it's often hard to find the right project because they don't necessarily know the business problem that they're trying to solve. That's a conundrum. So if we move to the next slide, this one looks at infrastructure factors. So now we're on that second dimension, organization, infrastructure. Same question, just these broke out on the infrastructure side. So here you can see that a lack of an enterprise data architecture and architecting a big data management system were the key challenges. These were up at about 25%. Again, the 461 respondents and over 2,000 different factors, actually ranked. So we find that many organizations that are early in their big data journey don't have an enterprise data architecture, much less a big data management system. Often the existing data warehouse, which you can see at the bottom as the last block here at about 17%, can't support a big data initiative. So again, that these are the kinds of questions that we're asking that this type of data actually informed the model and helped us build some of the questions that we're asking in the actual assessment. Next slide on the data management factors. In the data management category, again, the same question broken out now onto the data management factors. You can see that organizations are finding data quality, data types, metadata, and overall data management infrastructure a challenge. So maybe not at the same level as the skills, but at the same level as many of the other factors. Okay, so organization, infrastructure, data management, and if we move to the next slide on governance, governance issues also ranked high. Again, this was the same question. The lack of governance or stewardship and data ownership problems are 30% or more of the responses. So companies realize that governance is an issue. So these are 4 of the 5 factors in the model, and the 5th is analytics. If we move to the next slide. If you're not doing anything with your big data, if you're just collecting it, as I mentioned, then how useful is it? Analytics is the path to big data business value. So this is from a different question in that same report, which asked, if your organization were to successfully manage and leverage big data, which business and technology tasks would improve? Select 7 or fewer. Again, 461 respondents. And you can see that people thought that if they could collect and manage their data, then data analytics at 70%, would obviously improve. But also, underneath this data analytics are other things that would improve, like information exploration and discovery, more accurate and numerous insights, greater business value from big data. So you can see that we have these 4 categories, 4 dimensions, and also analytics as the 5th dimension, as the real path to big data business value. So what I want to do now is actually start to talk you through how to take the assessment. So if we move to the next slide, this is what we call our big data maturity assessment criteria, and the primary dimensions are in the big wheel, and the other factors are in the smaller wheel. And these primary dimensions are the same that I was just talking about. You can see it on the outside ring: organization, infrastructure, data management, analytics, and governance. And you can see on the big wheel that there are subcategories under each of these primary dimensions. So for example, on organization, the categories that we're going to ask questions about are leadership, funding, strategy, culture, and value. On the analytics front, we might ask questions about skills and mindset and techniques and applications and delivery methods. I'm not going to run through all of these. I think you get the idea that there's 5 dimensions, and you're asked questions in each of the dimensions. And there's about 70 questions in total in the big data maturity assessment that you're scored on. And then there's also other factors. For example, we'll ask questions about the cloud and outsourcing and BI in general. And we call these other factors because they don't necessarily go into the scoring of the model, but we're keeping this kind of information to help us evolve the model and the best practice recommendation for people taking the assessment. So for example, maybe people who are mature, have reached a maturity level in big data, maybe using the cloud. And we'll see that as we collect more and more data. And then we'll be able to feed that back into our best practices recommendations that are part of the assessment. I don't know yet if that's the case or not. I'm just using that as an example. So if we move to the next slide, as I mentioned, we came up with 2 pieces to this big data maturity model. One is the guide, and the other is the interactive assessment. So this is what the guide looks like. It's on our website now. And it describes the stages of maturity for big data, and it provides the characteristics for each stage. Chris is going to talk about those characteristics in a second, but this guide goes into a lot of detail about it. And it also explains the scoring of the model and how you'll be scored. And you can find it at tdwi.org/bdmm. Again, hope you're writing it down. That's the URL for the assessment. So there's the guide, and you can download that on the page where you can take the assessment, or after you take the assessment, you can download the guide. You can download the guide without taking the assessment, although we hope that you will take the assessment also. We think it'll be valuable. So if we move to the next slide, as I mentioned, the website URL, there it is again. You can see it there as BDMM. And once you get there, you'll see the maturity model in a big red box that says, take the assessment now. And I hope you can see that in the slide. And then, as I mentioned, you can also download the guide from this page. So if you click on take the assessment, you'll get to the questions page. So Krish, if we can move to that questions page. So here's an example of one of the questions pages, and this one's for the organization dimension. There's going to be a series of questions for each dimension, as I mentioned. So, for example, you may not be able to see this, but it says organization. This section asks a series of questions about organization related to your big data efforts. And so, for instance, under culture, we're going to ask questions about creativity and innovation, about if you take action using big data, questions about how collaborative your culture is. So you can already see that big data is not just about Hadoop. It's about a series of people, processes, and technologies. And when you select to take the assessment, you're going to get an email from the provider who's hosting the survey called IllumaView that gives you a login and a password information. So if you can use that if you want to complete the assessment at a later date, or even if 6 months from now you want to go back and retake the assessment. In fact, we encourage that. So you'll go through, you'll answer all of these questions, and then if we go to the next slide, at the end, what you're going to do is get feedback. So here's an example of part of the feedback report that you would get after you take the assessment. So we're going to give you feedback across each of the 5 dimensions. You'll get an overall score, which I don't know if you can see it, but it says overall score here is 50 out of 250. And then you'll get scores for the organization dimension, the infrastructure dimension, data management, and so on, page after page. So you can see here that the score put the respondent in the early adopter phase, and there's a box around that. So you'll get the score along with the score for those in your industry, that's in the box, as well as those for your company size. So you'll really get an understanding of where you stand relative to your peers. Now, until we get enough respondents, you might not see an average for the industry or company size. You'll see minimum and maximum scores. I think that we have enough respondents, at least in the major industries now, that you should be starting to see averages. And you'll also get a listing of what expectations are for those in your stage based on our research. And you'll receive some best practices advice for moving forward and getting to the next stage. So these best practices are based on what we heard from users who are at the next stage. So if you're an early adopter, for example, here in the organization dimension, the best practices will be about crossing the chasm to get to the corporate adoption stage. So let's find out more about those stages. Chris, I'm going to turn it back over to you for that.
Thanks, Fern. So the characteristics that we have come up with is going to be put across by each of those dimensions that you will take in the assessment. And the overall scoring and your weighted averages that you will get will take care of your availability of knowledge, people, processes, your availability of in-house/external help. So if you are a nascent organization, based on what we have seen from your inputs, the key characteristics that we would look for and would advise you are about how aware are your organizations about big data? Is your executive involved in this process? Is there an enterprise-wide architecture available? Is the organization using only structured data, which a lot of organizations today run with because that's what we have built so far? No skills in place, no governance. And when we say governance, we're talking about not just data governance, we're talking about PMO, data governance, and enterprise governance from an executive perspective. Moving from nascent, when you get into pre-adoption, your characteristics change. You have some analytics in the organization. You have some thinking about big data governance. You have issues because your volume of data and the formats of data are overloading your ability to think how to use that data. The bigger problem that we find in a pre-adoption state, which the first two bullets are, is that the value that big data gives is often seen as tactical. Hey, there is an issue on Twitter today, let's answer it. That's not the value from big data. That's a tactical action item. But if an organization jumps to that conclusion, which a lot of organizations today are because of the market, we find that to be a very pre-adoptive state of affairs. Education has begun with some executive support. CMO says, I want to get this organization's marketing campaigns very good. That's a good starting point, but that's not the end state. What happens when you move from there to early adoption? You get POCs underway, you have executives supporting, and typically IT department funds it, CIO, CTO budgets for a start, but we have seen organizations that are very successful having these POCs funded by the chief sales officer, chief marketing officer, chief risk officer. We have some amount of statisticians or data scientist teams in the organizations. We are seeing that organizations will start talking advanced analytics, and when we talk advanced analytics, we are going beyond the models that are available with SAS or R. We're talking about bringing in Mahout. We're talking about recommendation filtering. We're talking about machine learning, machine-to-machine communication, data identification techniques. These are things that show you how good you are from an early adopter state. As you move across, you will find that from nascent to early adopter, your advanced analytics is coming into place, and it actually is becoming something that is going to be available in pockets in the organization. A lot of companies that have worked with us on this, that have taken this assessment during different periods of time, have all started off saying that we are visionary and then have ended up almost coming into the early adopter state. And this includes some of those big name internet companies that have been leaders in pushing some of those infrastructure platforms out. And that's why we say big data maturity is not infrastructure alone. Then we come to the chasm. This is where the toughest jump an organization has to take will occur for big data. This will be completely guided by two things: the political makeup of the organization and the architecture and skill set placements. If a company can successfully govern itself from early adoption into corporate, and we have a couple of companies that are in this stage now, getting there We find that these organizations will have skill sets in place, data scientist teams in place, and the required analytics and infrastructure. Then comes corporate adoption. How does somebody get to this point? Analytics is a differentiator. Big data is not just IT. You have an ecosystem approach to the architecture. These are key pieces of innovation in an organization. The first three, if you use as checkboxes, you will find Facebook, Google, everybody checking the box. But then come to the last two pieces, center of excellence and the ability to use many forms of data. That is where some of these companies take a hit and they evolve themselves again and again. Then comes the visionary. This is the guru who's sitting on the mountaintop, looking at the whole plane, understanding what's going on. These organizations, when they come to this point in time, have the best governance in place, have the best analytics in place. At this point in time, if you ask me, tell me the name of the top 5 companies that are there in a visionary state, I don't know would be my answer from a big data perspective. I wouldn't want to be standing up and saying that LinkedIn and Facebook and Google or Hortonworks and Cloudera, I don't want to take these kinds of names because everybody have some point of problem that they're going to go through. So I don't typically want to state that we have a company in a visionary state, but we do have companies that are trying to get there. And if you want to look at one company that is really good at it, I think Google takes the spot in that particular point. But they still have to mature. They still are going through a lot of governance issues. So as we come to where we have come so far, I would like to invite Fern to talk about this snapshot for a minute, and then we will get to our closing note.
Thanks, Krish. So we also wanted to share with you some of the results that we're seeing in the big data maturity model to date. We went live with the big data maturity model a couple of weeks ago, and so far we've had about 170 maybe respondents take the assessment. This data was actually from last week, so there were about 125 people that had taken the assessment, although some had not yet completed it. And again, I urge you to take it today. So this data is totally obviously subject to change, as more and more people take it, but we wanted to give you sort of a snapshot of where we were. And what you see here is an average score on a scale from 1 to 5 regarding where companies are. 1 is nascent, 2 is pre-adoption, 3 is early adoption, and so on. So the scoring is a little bit different than what you would see in the assessment, but I think that the results are no surprise. And across the 5 dimensions here, and again, this is the average of those about 100 companies across the infrastructure, analytics, data management, governance, and organization dimensions, they're really falling into the pre-adoption phase. Some of the scores were a bit higher in the organization dimension, interestingly enough. But you can see that they all basically fall in the pre-adoption stage. So if we go to the next slide, we just look at some of the highs and lows in terms of where companies are. In terms of organization, what we're seeing with the data that we had as of last week, it was that these companies were reporting that they had executive sponsors and an innovative culture, but they had little funding and their roadmaps were pretty early in terms of big data. On the infrastructure side, mostly not surprising, most of them were data warehouse focused. And I will say that this was across many different industries and equally sort of across multiple company sizes. But it turned out on average that most of them were still data warehouse focused. And if they were using Hadoop, typically they were only using it for one workload. It wasn't being used for multiple workloads, and that's a sign of maturity is when you can use Hadoop for more than one type of workload. In terms of data management, the companies reported that they were sharing data, which was great, and had good access to data. On the other hand, they were collecting a couple different kinds of data, which was fine, except that they were analyzing less than that. Again, back to that structured data that Krish was talking about. We move to the next slide. In terms of analytics, on average, these companies were talking about the fact that they have an idea of the business problem that they're trying to solve, which is great. That you're like halfway there, at least you're getting there. And they didn't have a lot of advanced analytics. What's interesting is that we see one entry point into big data as a large, maybe 10 terabyte appliance with structured data with predictive analytics on top of it. And that's, one entry point into big data because companies can expand from there. And they would start to bring in more advanced analytics at that point. And in terms of governance, these companies reported that they feel that they understand security, but they understand security and privacy issues and compliance, so they rated higher on those, but they really haven't put much in place in terms of data stewardship and policies and whatnot for big data. And again, that's not surprising. So that's sort of a really quick snapshot of where these companies stand now. I want to turn it over to Krish for some closing notes.
Thanks, Fern. So as we come to the end of our keynote session this morning, first off, we want all of you to go and take the Big Data Maturity Model Assessment. Even if your organization is thinking about it, you're starting a POC, don't worry about it. Take it because it's going to help you create a roadmap. It's going to help you evolve. And the approach we have taken is not just to say, you have BI maturity, so jump in and run. We want to take you through the stages of crawl, sit, stand, walk, and run, because this data is different, it's complex, and it needs a lot of thinking and a lot of collaboration. So culture change has to happen in the organization. As we go over the next few months, we will be releasing reports as more data comes in, and these reports will have your feedback. We'll also take your feedback and we'll look forward to evolving the questionnaire and the maturity model. Characteristics will get, adjusted and upgraded, because as we go through and we learn more, we're going to do more. So as we go forward with your big data programs, good luck with those programs. We have, like I said, about 14 courses focused on advanced analytics and big data. And then TDWI has been always the foundational platform for data governance, program governance, and the other areas of BI that play into this realm. Here is our contact if you would like to get in touch with us. And again, thank you for attending the keynote. Good luck with the program. Have a nice couple of days. Thank you.